What if one of the poorest countries in the world suddenly told the richest institutions on earth, "We don't need your money anymore"? What if a young military captain stood up and said that foreign aid was never help, but a chain designed to keep Africa dependent forever? This is exactly what happened when Ibrahim Traoré took power in Burkina Faso, and the moment he began rejecting foreign aid, global powers started paying attention. For decades, Burkina Faso was trapped in a familiar cycle. International organizations and wealthy countries sent aid, loans, and development programs. On paper, it looked like generosity, but in reality, these funds often came with strict conditions: economic reforms, control over resources, and policies shaped by outside interests. Many African leaders accepted this system, but Traoré believed it was the very reason Africa remained poor. In 2022, the young army captain seized power during a military takeover. At just 34 years old, he became one of the youngest heads of state in the world. His rise shocked many observers, but what shocked them even more was his message. He said something very simple yet powerful. If a nation depends on foreign aid to survive, it is not truly sovereign. Soon after taking power, Traoré began redefining what independence meant. Political independence, he argued, was meaningless without economic independence. One of his first bold moves was rejecting financial assistance from institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These organizations had funded development programs across Africa for decades. But Traoré argued that the loans often created long-term dependency. Instead of solving poverty, they forced governments to follow policies that benefited global markets more than local people. Standing before his nation, he made a declaration that quickly spread across the continent. Burkina Faso would build its future with its own hands. For many Burkina-Faso citizens, the message was electrifying. For the first time in years, their leader was talking about dignity rather than dependence. But speeches alone do not change history. Traoré began turning those words into action. Burkina Faso sits on enormous gold reserves. In fact, it is one of Africa's largest gold producers. Yet for decades, most of that wealth flowed overseas through foreign mining companies. Traoré believed this was the heart of the problem, so his government began taking control of the country's gold industry. Major mines that had been operated by foreign corporations were brought under national ownership. A new mining policy ensured that the state would receive a significant share of profits from every project. Even more dramatically, the government banned the export of raw, unprocessed gold. Instead of shipping raw resources abroad to be refined elsewhere, Burkina Faso began building its own national gold refinery. The goal was simple: keep the value inside the country. For decades, Africa had exported raw materials while importing expensive finished products. Traoré wanted to reverse that system. To him, true sovereignty meant controlling what came out of the ground, but gold was only the beginning. Another pillar of Traoré's strategy was food sovereignty. Burkina Faso had long depended on imported food and foreign agricultural aid. Traoré believed that relying on outside food supplies made the country vulnerable to political pressure. So his government launched a major agricultural campaign. Hundreds of tractors, irrigation pumps, and farming machines were distributed to farmers across the country. Investments were made in seeds, irrigation systems, and food processing plants. The goal was not just to produce food, but to ensure the nation could feed itself. And early results began to appear. Grain production increased dramatically, reaching millions of tons in recent harvests. Africa News. For Traoré, this was about more than agriculture, it was about dignity. He believed that a country that feeds itself cannot easily be controlled by outside powers, but perhaps the most symbolic step in this revolution came with a national infrastructure initiative called Faso Mebo, which roughly means, "Let's build the country." Instead of relying heavily on foreign-funded projects, the program mobilized local workers, local materials, and national resources to build roads and urban infrastructure across the country. The message was clear: Burkina Faso would no longer wait for foreign donors to build its future. It would build it itself. Around Africa, millions of young people began watching closely. For them, Traoré represented something rare, a leader openly challenging a global system many believed had kept Africa economically dependent for decades. But with every bold move he made, pressure also began to grow. Foreign governments questioned his policies. International media debated his motives. Some praised him as a revolutionary. Others warned he was taking dangerous risks. Because rejecting foreign aid might sound heroic, but it also means standing alone in a world where powerful institutions rarely accept defiance. And soon, Traoré would face the biggest test of his vision, a test that would determine whether Burkina Faso could truly survive without the system it had relied on for generations. And that test was only just beginning. When Ibrahim Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would stop relying on foreign aid, many global analysts predicted disaster. They believed the country simply could not survive without outside funding. After all, Burkina Faso had long been listed among the world's poorest nations. International aid programs had financed everything from agriculture and healthcare to security operations. So when Traoré rejected that system, critics said the economy would collapse. But instead of stepping back, the young leader doubled down. He began redesigning the entire economic structure of the country. One of the most radical steps was transforming how national resources were managed. For decades, foreign mining companies controlled much of Burkina Faso's gold production. Huge quantities of gold left the country each year, while only a small percentage of the profit stayed in the national economy. Traoré saw this as a modern version of colonial extraction, so his government started reclaiming control. Several major gold mines were nationalized and brought under state ownership. The state also introduced rules guaranteeing a direct stake in mining operations so that more revenue would go to the Burkinabe people. At the same time, a national gold refinery was created so that the country could process its own minerals instead of exporting raw materials. This single decision had enormous implications, because when a country refines its own resources, it captures far more economic value, jobs, technology, and industrial growth. To Traoré, this was the key to breaking the cycle of dependency. But the economic changes did not stop there. The government also began focusing on building local industries. New tomato and cotton processing plants were launched to ensure that agricultural products were processed inside Burkina Faso instead of being exported cheaply and imported back as expensive goods. This strategy aimed to keep wealth circulating within the national economy rather than flowing outward. Traoré called this the foundation of real sovereignty. At the same time, the government tried to reduce foreign influence in other areas as well. Military agreements with former colonial power France were terminated, and foreign troops were asked to leave the country. For decades, France had maintained a strong military presence in several West African nations. Traoré argued that true independence required control over national security. Instead of relying on Western military support, Burkina Faso began strengthening regional cooperation with neighboring countries like Mali and Niger through a new alliance aimed at coordinating security and economic policies in the Sahel region. This marked a major geopolitical shift. For the first time in decades, several Sahel nations were openly challenging the traditional Western security framework in the region. Supporters called it a historic moment for African sovereignty, but critics warned that the strategy could isolate Burkina Faso internationally. The truth is that Traoré's policies are still unfolding, and the results remain complex. Burkina Faso continues to face enormous challenges. The country is battling extremist insurgencies that have displaced millions of people and destabilized large parts of the territory. Economic transformation is never easy, especially for a nation already dealing with security crises. Yet despite these obstacles, Traoré's message continues to resonate far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa and even globally, millions of people see his leadership as part of a larger debate about sovereignty in the modern world. For decades, foreign aid has been presented as the solution to poverty. But Traoré asks a different question: what if the system itself keeps poor nations dependent? His policies reflect an older revolutionary philosophy once championed by African leader Thomas Sankara. Sankara famously warned that aid could become a tool of control. Traoré appears determined to prove that warning correct.